These days, you can create music in lots of different ways. You can use a computer. You can click on a piano roll in that computer with a mouse and lay down a beat and a melody. Very easy. You can use a drum pad or a drum machine to create a beat. You can even use an old-fashioned method of using a keyboard, either on a synth or a MIDI keyboard. Or, of course, you can use a sequencer. Now, I love sequencers, and I have loads of them. Now, one of my favorites is this, the Ground Control from Endorphins. It's a lot of fun, and I think it can make you a better music producer in just 1 week. Now, almost everyone has a computer these days, and every computer can be used to make music. Now, a lot of iconic tracks have in fact been made on a laptop, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's something magical about using an interface with buttons and switches on it rather than clicking a mouse on a screen. It allows you to use your ears, not your eyes, to make music, and it creates the opportunity for mistakes, happy accidents as they're known. And sometimes those mistakes end up sounding better than you had even imagined. But of course, learning anything new is a challenge. Each new bit of gear comes with a lengthy manual. This one in particular is 57 pages long and possibly hours of YouTube videos that you can explore. But it doesn't need to be difficult. If you focus on the really key functions of the ground control, I believe that anyone can learn to master it within a week. And I'm going to show you my simple 3-step process for doing just that. Starting today with part 1. Drum programming. Now, when I first recorded this video, I had the ground control set up as part of a Eurorack system. There were wires everywhere, there were 100 patch points, and the system cost around £5,000. I was getting totally distracted by all the options in front of me, and I stopped. I had a sudden realization. I wouldn't even have watched my own video. It wasn't simple, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't fun. So I scrapped it, started again, and now I have the ground control set up on its own, using Ableton on my laptop only as a sound source and to record the output. And I've had so much fun playing with it that it's taken me a few hours to remember that I was actually supposed to be making a video. If you stick around until the end, I'll also answer the question that I know you want answering. Can it drum and bass? So let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing to go through is a quick orientation of what we have here. This is the ground control sequencer from Endorphins, and it has one drum track, and these are the drum outputs, 8 different drum trigger outputs. It has 3 melodic tracks with a pitch and gate CV output pairs here, 1, 2, and 3. And it has lots of inputs for clock and reset. And most importantly, and the most significant thing, it has a 2-octave keyboard right here on the surface. And that is what makes this maybe not completely unique, but very rare in the world of Eurorack. The first step of step 1 is to focus on the drums. Now, ignore most of what this sequencer can do. I'm not even going to mention tracks 1, 2, and 3. Well, apart from then and a few seconds ago when I talked about tracks 1, 2, and 3. But apart from that, we are going to focus on the drums exclusively. We're also not going to go into what all of these patch points do. I want to keep this extremely simple. I have this connected to my laptop. So the only cable here is this one here, which is a MIDI cable, which is going straight into Ableton, and it is triggering some sounds in Ableton. So all of these patch points here are going to remain unused and unpatched, and I'm not even going to really talk about them. See, when you first dive into something complicated, the key is to keep it simple. It could be anything from learning the piano to learning a new recipe. My view is that it's important to ignore almost everything and to focus on the one thing you want to learn from it today. And today, we're going to learn to build a groove and nothing else. Now, there are 3 or maybe even 4 ways of recording on this thing, and eventually you may want to learn them all. But we're going to learn to program drums using step recording, which is by far the most familiar way most of you will ever have programmed drums. So let's use the knowledge we already have and apply it to the ground control. These buttons here select the track that you control. So the one here that says track D, this is the drum. So if we press track D, then we have access to our 8 triggers, and they are on these steps here. It says 1, 2, it actually says P/1, Q/2. The P and the Q are for various project and pattern settings, so ignore them for now. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that corresponds to these 8 triggers out, or in my case, the 8 triggers out that are going over MIDI on MIDI channel 10 into Ableton, where I have a very simple drum rack with some sound. So on 1, I have a kick, 2, have a snare, sort of rimmy type snare. 3, slightly different. I'm calling it a rim shot, but it's kind of snare-like as well. 4 is my closed hat sound. 5 is an open hat. And then 6 is a bass sound. 7 is a vocal sample, and 8 is an organ sample. So today I'm going to see if I can create a simple drum and bass groove. Very simple 2-bar loop probably. And the key to using this effectively, I think, is to not use the drum tracks exclusively for drum sounds, but also to use them for occasional bass hits or organ hits, something where you're not playing with the pitch, because none of these tracks can change the pitch of a sound. And that just adds a certain amount of flexibility where you come to creating a whole track. You then have 3 melodic tracks for something else, which we'll see in the next video. Before we do anything, let's open up a completely blank program. So if you press the star button, which is like this sort of shift function on this, press this, and then this escalator button, which is the slide or last step button. So this is the project menu. We're on project D here, flashing, and the ones that are lit have already got something in them. So we'll choose a completely blank one. We'll choose F here, and that'll load. And now this is completely blank. So if I press play, which is the triangle button with the circle in it here, we're playing, there's no sound, there's nothing on it. So the first thing we want to do is set the tempo. So if you press the running man here, this is the tempo button, we're at 120. So we can go up by 1s, or we can go up by 10s by pressing these buttons here. So let's go up to something more drum and bass, 174. So we're now set. We're on drum track. If I want to program the kick drum to start with, I select the kick drum using this button here, and I select how many steps I want this to be. By default, it is 16 steps. So if you press and hold last step, you'll see this particular track is 16 steps, and that's fine for the kick. And then to actually put steps down using step record, you hold the record button for a second, and then you can place triggers down on this keyboard here. Now, slightly strange way that it does it is that this keyboard isn't quite wide enough to have 16 steps. So if you count the steps along the bottom, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We have 14 steps. Now, the ones that are on the beat are helpfully circled with the black circle. So if we wanted a 4 to the floor, we could select those. And then if I press play, that's our 4 to the floor beat. To go back into step recording, we're still on the kick drum. Press and hold the record, the steps light up. So the second step is actually this one here, and the 15th step is actually this one here. And that is slightly strange, slightly confusing. I would much rather it was slightly wider and you had all 16 steps, but in Eurorack, space is at a premium, so I can understand why they did it. Right, let's remove these steps just by pressing them again and program something that's slightly more drum and bass. So we'll have a step here and we'll have a step here. And then if we press play, okay, so far so good. Let's get a snare in there. So we select the sound that we want, and we hold down record, and again we are in record mode. If we hold down last step, we're 16 steps. Now this one I don't want it to repeat quite so often, so I'm going to go for 32 steps, which you do by holding that and pressing the arrow. So we're now in 32 steps, and we can just program down what we want. So if we want a snare on the 2 and the 4, it would be this. Now, because this is 2 patterns, if I press, this is the first 16 steps. If we want to get to the second 16 steps, the arrows advance your step by 1, but the plus and minus will get you to page 2 effectively. So this is page 2, and you can see that it's blank. So if we press play now, we will have a snare on the 2 and the 4, and then a pause. So let's see what that sounds like. So you see in the second bar, we have no snare because I've made it 32 steps. Okay, let's get back into it. So on the first page, we'll have steps 5 and 13 here, basically on the 2 and the 4. And then on the second page, which is currently blank, we will have 5 and 13, and we'll add in some ghost notes, which at the moment won't sound so good because we haven't done anything with velocity, but let's play this and then I'll show you how to adapt it. Okay, so it sounds okay, but the one thing this can do in terms of modulation is you can program velocity on each track. Now the downside is you can't actually output that velocity in Eurorack because we only have one modulation output here, and you can send one drum track's velocity out here, and the melodic tracks pitch and gate have no velocity output. But using MIDI you can output the velocity and it does affect the sound. So if we again hold the record button, go back into it, we have our pattern. If we then hold the 16th button down, we get into velocity record. The way this works is slightly counterintuitive. So it tells you the step number you're on, step 1. And if you remember, we only had hits on step 5 and 13. So step 1, this here represents 0 velocity. You can change the velocity by either pressing one of these buttons along the bottom or by using the plus and minus. So this is the V for velocity going up, but we will leave step 1 on 0. And if we use the arrow keys to advance, if we get to step 5, you see step 5, I know there's a hit there, and it immediately jumps up to this button, which is full velocity. You sort of have to know where your hits are, although I guess if it's on 0, you know there's no hit. If you're on this end button here, you know that you're on full volume. So that one I do want to stay on full volume, and the same for the next one, which is step 13. It's on page 2 where it's the ghost notes I want to adjust, so that must be the first hit. Okay, so this is then the second hit in the second bar, which I want to be lower. So maybe we'll choose that one, which is at 72. Then if I keep increasing the number of steps, that's our other hit on the 4 of the second bar. If we go to the very last step, step 16 of bar 2, we also want that to be lower. And then if I press play, you'll be able to hear that there's a bit of dynamic range on those snares now. So I think that sounds pretty good. Right, so far so good. So let's record the next one. We now have a rim shot. And I also want this to be 32 bars. So we do the same again. Hold down the record button. Now on the first bar, I don't want any hits at all. So we will press the arrow button. Oh no, we'll press the plus button to get onto page 2. Do get that wrong every time, but it's no big deal. And then we want 2 hits right at the end of the bar, probably something like that. So the first bar there's nothing, and there's a couple of hits on the second bar. Yeah, that'll do. Next one. Right, closed hat. Hold down record. So the closed hat. This one, I want a few hits. I'm not sure exactly where. We'll maybe make it sound good with a bit of velocity. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, but I think with all hats, you definitely need some sort of dynamics to make it sound a bit more interesting. So if we again go into record mode and press the 16th button, this gets us to the velocity. And so we will just play with the velocity. So let's start, well, this is going to be a little bit random. So every time we have a hit, I will adjust the velocity so that we have a bit of range, and I get some a bit quieter and some a bit louder, and then maybe louder, and then maybe that'll do. Okay, we're getting there. Now what we haven't done yet is save anything, so I think it's important to save our progress. So to save it, you press the star button, you press the record button, and then you press it again. That saves every track, every pattern into Project F. Okay, so the next one is an open hat. Now I don't need much of this. This is more of an intro to the pattern. So if we hold record, I only want 16 steps. And I just want a hit at the start, I think. So that repeats every 2 bars, that's fine. Now what I didn't say is when we're recording, you'll see that these 4 letters here correspond to patterns on our project. And they correspond to the 4 tracks. So the one on the left is drums, then track 1, 2, and 3. And we're on pattern A for all of them. And we haven't obviously recorded anything, but you can have up to 24 patterns. So you can get A through to Z with a couple of letters not used. But you can see on drum track, there's a small dot to the right of the A. That means that we've made changes that are not saved. So if we do the same again and go start, record, record, that will have recorded everything and the dot has now gone. Right, now let's go on to the first bass. Now this one, we will go into record. Again, I want it to be 16 steps, which it is by default. And I only want a few hits here. There maybe, and there. Yeah. And again, let's while we're here, we don't have to go out and change the velocity. We'll press the velocity button and immediately we can change the velocity on step 7, step 8. We'll go to the end one. I want the last one to be lower velocity. Maybe there. Let's see what that sounds like. Yeah, I think that's quite good. Our next sound is a vocal sample. Again, I just really want this to introduce the phrase. So I'm going to put it on the first step of each bar. And I think it'll be okay repeating every bar. We'll just add to certain something. Okay, and then our final sound on is this organ, which has a bit of delay on it. So we will record this in. We want this to be 32 steps. And again, I want this just in there to add a bit of variety. So we're not actually going to, again, I got that wrong. It's not the arrows, it's the plus or minus button. I want this to introduce the second phrase. So I want it to be on the first beat of the first step of the second bar. And that now sounds like this. Okay, sounding pretty good. Let's save that. So now we have a basic drum groove, which sounds okay. So that's pretty good to me. Now next, we really need to try and make the groove a bit more, if you know what I mean. But what do I mean by that? Well, there are many phrases on YouTube which are commonly used when talking about a drum loop. Now, if everything is exactly on the grid, so exactly hitting each of these 16 steps that we've programmed, and each of these are, of course, equal time division, so they're exactly 1/16th of a bar, then it's usual to describe a groove like this as robotic. Now, I dislike this phrase as there are no robots involved. We did make this groove using a machine. Is the ground control a robot though? I'm not sure. I could have done the same thing with my laptop. Is that a robot? Well, maybe. But if instead this loop was described as hypnotic, well, that's okay, because if it's hypnotic, then you can fit it into a certain genre of music, usually called minimal techno. So you don't need much groove if it's minimal techno, you just need it to be robotic and repetitive. I'm going to try and avoid using phrases like this because I don't think they mean very much. What we really want to do to make the dynamic range change, and as you've seen, what I've done as I've gone through is to change the volume. Now, it is slightly disappointing that you can't do this in a Eurorack system, but there are ways around that. The advantage of me using MIDI today is that I can demonstrate quite quickly that you can add in ghost notes and the velocity really helps. So the loop at the moment sounds like this. So now that I've added that velocity, I am allowed to, according to YouTube law, I'm allowed to describe this loop as sounding more human. Indeed, altering the velocity on certain loops can often be done in some software plugins using a button labeled Humanize. So we have created a robotic, machine-like beat, and now we have made it human. Great. What else can we do? Well, the ground control can also add swing to the drum track. So to access the swing, you hold the running man here, and you press the G button, which is labeled shuffle, and you enter shuffle 50. Now default is 50, and that means there is no swing. As I move the swing up, what is happening is that each second 16th note, so steps 2, 4, 6, etc., is being delayed slightly so that it hits a bit later than it would if it was exactly on the grid. So you can hear, or you should be able to hear, if I keep going, it'll get a bit kind of wonky and out of sync. And at 66, you're actually a perfect triplet time, which doesn't quite sound great. So let's go back to something like 55, which sounds good. And then we will save that because the swing settings are then saved with the project. Now, swing is a feature that first appeared on the 1979 drum machine LM1 by Roger Linn, and there's much debate about which machine sounds the best, with some claiming that the early MPCs had the best swing and that it can't be replicated without one of those actual machines. Now, I'm afraid to tell you that swing is actually a mathematical calculation, and Roger Linn has said so himself. So all the swing settings do is mathematically move those notes on the second 16th note of each pair, move them slightly later by a specific mathematical amount, and every swing on every machine and every door does exactly the same. And I know this is sacrilege and most people won't believe me anyway, but that doesn't stop it being true. Anyway, back to our pattern at swing of 55. Sounds pretty good. So now, finally, having adjusted the swing and having adjusted the velocity levels, we are allowed to call our groove organic. We have created a loop on a machine and set a specific volume level for each step and added mathematical swing. And now we have a living, breathing, organic drum loop. Nevertheless, whatever terminology you want to use, I think it sounds pretty good. And we have answered the question that I asked at the start. Yes, indeed, the ground control can drum and bass. Yes, it can. And hopefully that's given you an idea how quickly and easily you can program drums with the ground control. Now, it's not perfect. Not having the 16 steps along the bottom does take some getting used to, but I understand why they did it. Programming velocity is a nice touch, but it would have been better if there was a knob, I think, that you could twist as the pattern was playing and record some variation. And while the per-track velocity is output via MIDI, if this was a Eurorack case, you can only output one track's velocity to the rest of the system. So you'd need to find another solution if this was a full Eurorack case. And in fact, I'm going to show you exactly how I did just that in a subsequent video. So that's it for now. If you want to know what the second step is towards mastering the ground control, then please subscribe to the channel. Now, in the meantime, if you're interested in how to use hardware effects with Ableton, then check out my 7-part series on the Eventide H90 pedal. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.